Today we're going to be attempting to design the perfect to-do list app from the ground up. That's right, we're starting with nothing today and just seeing what we come up with. I've personally grown frustrated over the years with all the productivity apps. None of them seem to do quite what I want them to do, so I'm just going to build it myself.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
My goal with this video is to help new designers and developers understand what actually goes into making a modern software product, and hopefully demystify all the woo-woo that exists in the design realm, and maybe take a stab at designing something themselves. We'll start by defining a color profile and selecting some typography, and then we'll design a really functional wireframe that lays out the structure for the app, and finally we're going to jump into Figma and make this bad boy come to life. Let's get started. Selecting the correct colors and typography for your app has a profound effect on everything else, so it's really important that you get this right. Seriously, you can never underestimate the impact that a bad typeface has on an otherwise awesome UI. In this UI, I want to go for something that's simple, professional, but still kind of fun. I don't want the app to take itself too seriously. After all, this is something that I'm expecting users are going to use every day of their life. I don't want to be filled with existential dread every time I open up my phone. So to tackle the colors, I headed over to Coolors, link in the description, and spent about 30 minutes exploring different options. The cool thing about this site is it will constantly recommend colors that seem to match the profile of other colors that you've already locked in. In this example, I settled in on this really nice off blue. I felt like that really communicated the kind of feel I wanted users to feel in this app. And also the orange is a delightful accent color that isn't too intimidating. So I locked those in and then shuffled through various neutral colors to get one that complemented both of those, and then just went with those. Once I have 3 hex codes for primary accent, secondary accent, and a base neutral color, I usually head to a site like Tint and Shade Generator and then just generate lots of different shades and permutations of those colors in order to broaden the color spectrum a little bit and give myself a little more flexibility. Getting lots of different shades of your brand colors is one of those seemingly small things that has a profound impact on a design. It allows you to control the visual hierarchy very specifically, and it's one of those things that often takes designs from good to great. When choosing a typeface, I usually just like to go to Google Fonts and scroll for something that just feels right. Feelings are really hard to reproduce though, so technically speaking, we don't necessarily want a font that has lots of sharp edges. We probably want a little bit more rounded corners to make it feel a little more friendly, but it still needs to be very highly readable and symmetrical. You also generally want to pick a font that has lots of different weight options. If you stick with one that only has bold and regular, you're very limited in how you can control visual hierarchy. I ended up settling on a font called Jost, and I've used this one before. I really like it. It's kind of my go-to whenever I'm looking for a fun font that still feels professional. At the end of the day, it's just a modern, legible typeface that has a little bit of personality added to it. That's it. So now that we've got a simple style guide to work with, it's time to build out the structure of the app. And I want to note that we don't want to go straight to Figma and straight to the UI part of this design, because then you're trying to solve 2 big problems at once: function and form. I want to just figure out the function first. Where should everything be laid out on the page structurally, and then I'll come back and address the form and make it look really polished and clean. So we're going to build a wireframe first, but in order to do that, we need to go a step further back and define user stories. These are a usually ranked list of all of the things that you're expecting a user would be able to do in your application. So in this example, of course, I want to be able to view all my to-dos in one place. I want to create a new to-do. I want to mark my to-do as complete. I want to view the details of all my to-dos, maybe some child tasks, perhaps a description. I want to find a to-do that I created previously, and I want to access and edit my account settings. These 6 things need to be dead easy to do in the app. and the ones at the top of the list need to be so much easier to do than the others because they're more important. That's why we rank these user stories. It gives us a relatively impartial way to evaluate the efficacy of a UI once we're done with the wireframe. If it's very difficult, for example, to do the thing at the very top, but very easy to do the thing at the very bottom, we probably have the visual hierarchy messed up somehow. We need to rearrange things and flip that on its head. And now we're ready to build a wireframe, which is essentially, if you think about home building, the blueprint from which you will actually design a home. Of course, we're going to need some kind of navigation, but I really want to only focus on to-dos here. I don't want to embrace the feature bloat that most of these other productivity apps seem to have done. So we're strictly only letting them switch context, search for to-dos, and perhaps access an account menu. Next, we'll roughly sketch how a to-do should look like based on the visual hierarchy of the metadata for each to-do item. So the to-do text is of course the most important, followed by the status, is it complete or not? I also want to know what the due date is for a particular task, and then what kind of category it falls in. Is this something I would do in my professional life or my personal life? Maybe I have different lists and I want to organize things. And then finally, I want to give users a way to create a new task. So I'm just going to have a floating action button somewhere, probably close to where most people's thumbs are when they're holding their phone. We'll likely need an option in the settings though for left-handed users if we take this kind of approach. If I was to click on one of these to-dos, there's a couple of things I'd want to see there. Of course, I need to identify which to-do I've clicked on, but I also want to outline the metadata, all of the rich metadata that was omitted from the overview screen. I also want to show some subtasks, create some space for additional contextual actions, and we'll also need some way to let the user get back to the main list if we need to. Cool, so now that we have a blueprint in place, let's get into Figma and start designing this bad boy. I generally like to start with the nav bar. It's essentially the map that users use to navigate your application, so intuitively it kind of makes sense to start there. It's also at the top of the page. We move the search bar up into the header space itself. Since this app doesn't have an identifying mark or a logo or anything, we have a whole bunch of horizontal real estate and a ton of room for activities now.
Give us so much extra space in our room to do activities.
Now, let's get into the task component itself. Again, the visual hierarchy is key here. The task's name takes prominence, followed by type and then metadata. We played around with color, opacity, and alignment in order to realize this visual hierarchy. And just from looking at this individual component, I think we've achieved that goal. We also need some sort of visual cue for task completion. I need to know if this is finished or not. And a simple check mark and strike through, I think, are enough of a treatment to communicate that idea to the user. And if we were actually building this, we should probably also fade this task out and hide it completely because it's no longer relevant in this context. We'll also pop a cheeky floating action button in the lower right here with a very subtle drop shadow to imply that it's floating above everything else. In the details view, we shift our focus entirely to one specific task. But why is it full screen? Now there's two reasons. Number one, we can assume that if the user clicks on one of these, they're probably only interested in that task. So we want a different visual hierarchy to communicate the relevant information to the user without the distractions of another part of the UI. The second reason is we kind of do need the space on mobile. It's very hard to display all the metadata, all the subtasks, a description even, in a modal UI. You really need its own context. So it's very important that we identify which task we're looking at, and then the metadata also helps with that, so it will come next. And then after this, we're just going to kind of repurpose the same task component to list out all of the subtasks for, say, a compound task, something like going to the grocery store. You also want a list of all the groceries. And then at the bottom, we'll also put some context actions if users want to complete the task there or edit it somehow. Now, given that we've consumed the full screen, we need to give users a way to get back to the main UI. Of course, they could just press the back button or do some sort of back gesture on mobile, but there is a lot of affordance around a back button in the upper left to allow the user to get back to their previous UI, so that's how we'll do that as well. Adding a new task should be seamless, but it comes with a little bit of a complication. We don't necessarily want to consume the entire viewport like we did for the item details view, and there's two reasons for that. The first is just simply that we don't have to. You don't need to display a full screen of information in order to create a new to-do. You just really need the metadata, or at least the initial metadata and some brief details to get going, and then you can edit it later in a dedicated view. We really only need about half of the screen max. But also, since we've positioned this floating button next to the thumb, it's likely that the user might accidentally click on it when they're scrolling. So we need to give them a very low-cost way to get right back to the previous UI by giving them a bunch of negative space to click on above the modal that will just dismiss that modal. It's worth noting that that's always generally a good idea. It's just that we can get away with it for this modal because we don't need to display as much information. And there you have it. I hope that this small exercise has helped to communicate that design is really just about understanding your user's needs and then kind of ranking them in the context in which they're going to be doing that thing. And then once you've done that, you can take that and synthesize it into a wireframe and a design, and hopefully eventually a product. Even the most complicated SaaS products in the world use this process. It's just at a much larger scale with lots of different subcontexts and things like that. So I hope you found at least one little nugget of design insight here. If you have any ideas for what kind of UI you'd like to see me design from scratch next, pop a comment below, and either way, I'll see you next week. Have a good one.